Hello, Redeeming Life Church. Pastor Brett here. Last week, we continued our series of the new normal, and we talked about Ephesians 2, verses 1 through 10. And in that, we discovered Paul's vision for us, how the new normal affects our personal identity in Christ and how that plays out. We talked about how we are His masterpiece, that we are made for good works, that God has prepared them beforehand, that we should walk in them. This coming week, as we look at chapter 2, verses 11 through 22, we're going to see now that Paul walks us through what the new normal looks like for us corporately as the church, the capital C. Not just one local expression, but the global church, all believers, and how now that we've been transformed by Christ, that He has saved us by His grace, we are now His workmanship, prepared for good works. Now, how does all of that play out together as the church, and what does that look like? And how, more specifically, does that take place? And so that's kind of the thrust of what Paul's going to talk about in our text this coming week. So I just want to encourage you to take a look at that this week, but spend some time in it, read in it, really soak in the Word, and you're going to see that Paul encourages you right off the bat in for the first few verses to never forget. He says in the ESV translation multiple times to remember that you were once far off, and he references the relationship between the Jews and the Gentiles, and how the Jews were God's chosen people, and yet they were also far off, but for a different reason than the Gentiles. But the Gentiles were also far off, but we see that because of Christ and His death, that they both have been brought near because of the death of Christ on the cross and what that accomplished, and that through the peace of Christ now we are being built together, all of God's people being built together into a place where God's presence can dwell. So there's some really cool illustrations in there that Paul uses towards the end of that passage. And so just want to encourage you to be thinking about this, that as God has brought all people, Jews and Gentiles alike, all of us come from different backgrounds with different issues and sins that we struggle with, yet through what Christ has accomplished on the cross, that is really the central piece where we come to find unity amongst each other. We may have different lifestyles, we may have different methods of reading the Bible, we may have different ways that we do things as believers, but ultimately we should be able to find unity, if nothing else, in the cross of Christ, and that should be the place where we start. And so one of the things to be thinking about this week is there any groups of people in your life that you struggle with in your attitudes, your thoughts, or your words, in terms of unity? Maybe those are Christian people, maybe those are people that you've been burned in the past by. Well, even if that is the case, we're going to see in this passage that Paul is basically encouraging us and showing us through the example that he gives for the Jews and the Gentiles that Christ died so that there would be unity in the church. Regardless of your theological position on certain things, regardless of how you practice worship and how church happens, Christ died so that we would be one. We see this beautifully outlined for us in Jesus' prayer in John 17, specifically in verses 20 through 23. Jesus is praying to the Father, and He is praying that me and you would be one, even as the Father and Him, meaning Jesus, are one. And so that was Jesus' prayer for His disciples and for all believers, is that no matter what, in all things, that we would be unified, that we would be one, even as Jesus was one with the Father. I mean, that is an incredible connection of unity. God, the Father, and Jesus Christ being united as one. His prayer is that me and you would be one like that. Obviously, that is something that we will never reach or attain to in perfection, but we certainly have the encouragement of the Word that we should move in that direction. So as you think about that this week, be praying that God would open your eyes to see any weak spots in your own life, and how if you need to seek reconciliation on behalf of another Christian or believer, that you would do that. You'd have the confidence and the courage to obey the Word, to seek reconciliation with your brother, ask for forgiveness, seek unity above all things. And so I'm praying for you this week. I look forward to seeing you guys and continuing the conversation on Sunday.